Is that the I'm live sign? Okay. It is time to begin-ish, and then some. We are in 1 Thessalonians chapter 3, and we're going to dive in here in just a minute. Let everybody wander in. Colin, you want to say a word of prayer for us, and we'll get started? Amen. So I've been trying to come up with a kind of practical-ish question to ask along with our chapter-by-chapter study so that we don't get lost in the weeds of what the chapter is about. And for chapter 3, decided I want to talk about how to build a caring community culture. And that's a lot of C words. What I mean by that was when you think about a church and you describe a good church, a lot of times you'll say, well, everybody there seems to care about each other. And then you describe a not so good church, and people will say, well, people just didn't even seem to care I was there. Okay. So the amount of concern members have for each other and for guests is one of the measures of the health of that congregation. Thing is, everybody knows that. Like, nothing I just said was secret information embedded somewhere in somebody's dissertation. Like, that's just general consensus. If your church feels like they care for people, then people are going to like your church. Good, healthy church. So why doesn't everybody do it? Because it's not as simple as preaching 52 sermons a year on caring, or making your church motto the caring place, or anything like. There's no simple way to just say, oh, well, we care now. You can't guilt people into caring, for example. That's kind of counterproductive, it turns out. That it has to be developed some other way. So today, what we want to look at from 1 Thessalonians chapter 3, we're going to see an example of a church and, in this case, an apostle that have a lot of care for each other. They are very affectionate to each other. And we want to know, what are the features of that we might imitate? What can we learn from it and apply to our church? So we're going to divide the chapter into 3 parts. If you're going to have somebody that cares, you got to have a caregiver, you got to have a care receiver, and you got to have a caring God. Those are the 3 elements that make a caring church what it is. So, starting with the caregiver, you might guess is going to be, in this case, the Apostle Paul. Let me read from chapter 3, 1 through the first part of verse 3. Therefore, when we could bear it no longer, we were willing to be left behind at Athens alone, and we sent Timothy, our brother and God's co-worker in the gospel of Christ, to establish and exhort you in your faith, that no one be moved by these afflictions. Okay. What kind of emotional language did you notice in that sentence? Couldn't bear it, right? We couldn't bear it any longer. That's not an intellectual term. Like if Paul knew it made sense for him to move on from Thessalonica to Athens to Corinth, logically he knew that was the thing to do. That wasn't in question. The issue was that every day that passed became emotionally more difficult for him to do the thing that he knew intellectually was the practical thing to do. Why? Because he really did have an affection for the church that he had left behind. And then the other word, we were willing to be left behind at Athens alone, and we sent Timothy. So again, in his head, he knows what will make the most effective ministry in Athens. Paul and Timothy working together in Athens. But his concern for the church at Thessalonica has built up to a breaking point where he does something impractical for Athens in order to send Timothy back to check on the church he's worried about. Okay, that's emotional decision making, which isn't bad, by the way. We all are supposed to do some of that. We get into trouble when we only do that, right? When it's only emotional decision making. But Paul says, yeah, I had skin in the game. I cared about those people, and that influenced my decision. And so I was willing to be left behind by myself, which wasn't a good idea, so that Timothy could go back and visit you folks over there in Thessalonica. And he was going to establish and exhort you in your faith. Even those words. What was Timothy going to do? Establish and exhort you. It wasn't a concrete, practical job. Timothy's going to go back and he's going to hand you this check, and then you'll have funds in this amount. He's going to reassure you, right? It was something that he felt like they needed spiritually or emotionally, not practically. Timothy couldn't make the persecution go away when he got there. He couldn't make them, instead of 8-month-old Christians, 80-year-old Christians, right? He couldn't shortcut that process. So in practical terms, what can Timothy do when he gets there? Nothing. But in terms of relational terms, he could be supportive of these new converts in their difficult situation. So Paul is motivated by a genuine burden of care for this church. He just can't bear it any longer. And in fact, he says that twice. We haven't got to the other verse. But in verse 1, when he could bear it no longer, we sent Timothy. And then verse 5, it's first person. When I could bear it no longer, I sent. Right? That he himself is personally burdened by his affection for these people. He says we were willing, which indicates this was a free choice of Paul and his little group. They weighed the options, they made the choice, and a lot of that had to do with his love and tender feelings towards the church at Thessalonica. So when I'm looking at Paul as a caregiver, he is not a stoic, is he? Put this in slightly dated pop culture. He's not Spock, right? The cold analytic critter, right, who is unfazed by emotions. I think when you read Paul, you think that might be him, because he is a pretty logical guy, very thoughtful, nuanced. But he's actually a very passionate person who makes decisions, in some cases, that affect the whole church all over the place, based on the fact that he really misses those guys. And remember, it's you say, well, you're supposed to like other Christians. There were other Christians in Athens. There were other Christians in Berea. There were other Christians in Philippi. There were Christians in all the places Paul left, but he felt some kind of like personal attachment to this one group that he just keeps trying to check back in on. In 2 Corinthians, he describes to the Corinthians what it means to be an apostle and to suffer. And listen to the ways that Paul suffers. And there's a punchline at the end, so just wait for it. But first, he lists all the physical hardships of being an apostle. Are they servants of Christ? I am a better one. I'm talking like a madman. And that sentence makes no sense. But what he's doing, he's comparing himself to fake apostles in the context. He's saying those guys aren't real apostles. They say they're a servant of Christ. I'm a real servant of Christ. Let me show you how. Were any of those guys imprisoned? And then he starts listing the things he's done for the gospel. So he's not just bragging. He's contrasting the charlatans who never had to give up anything to himself who had actually suffered. He says, if you're going to believe one of us, it ought to be me. Anyway, far greater labors, far more imprisonments, countless beatings, and often near death. The expression countless beatings. How many fights have you been in your life? Like, not arguments, like punches were thrown fights. I don't have a long list. How many times did you get beat senseless? Again, not a long list, presumably shorter. I hope I won some of those. The idea that I can't remember how many times I was beat senseless for the gospel. Like, I think I could remember 3 or 4 times I was beat up. If I got beat up as a minister of the gospel, I think it'd be a pretty short list. Paul says, I can't even count the times I've been beat up for preaching the gospel. And that's just, it's not like I can't count how many potluck dinners I've been to. It's, I can't count how many times I got beat up for the gospel. Things I can count, he says, I know 5 times I received at the hands of the Jews the 40 lashes less one. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once they stoned me to death. Okay. The 40 lashes less one, anybody know what that's about? There was a law that you could only give 40 lashes. And the Jewish magistrates, being conscientious of not breaking their law, would always do 39 just in case they didn't go over the 40 by miscounting. So they were concerned with how many times they hit you. Not so much that he didn't deserve to be hit in the first place, right? But let's make sure we don't hit him too many times. There's rules. So that's Paul just, I remember 5 times there was 40 minus 1. 3 times rods. 1 time they threw rocks at my head. But then he goes on and says, well, let me tell you what really hurts. 3 times I was shipwrecked. A night and a day I was adrift at sea on frequent journeys. In dangers from rivers, danger from robbers, danger of my own people, danger from Gentiles, danger in the city, danger in the wilderness, danger at sea, danger from false brothers, and toil and hardship through many a sleepless night, and hunger and thirst, often without food and cold exposure. It's rough to be Paul, but he's not done. What's the hardest thing about being an apostle? Verse 28, 29. And apart from other things, the daily pressure on me of my anxiety for all the churches. Who is weak and I'm not weak? Who is made to fall and I am not indignant? There's all the things that happened to Paul, and he says those are rough. But every day I also relive everything that happens to you folks. Every time somebody he had taught the gospel to got beat up, that was one more time Paul died a little inside. Paul would preach and teach that you should not have fear and anxiety, you have your faith and all that, but Paul says, but I've got some, by the way. Isn't that, like, he's so confident in other places, he says, except when it comes to you. I'm afraid of what they're going to do to you. And he lives with that every day. Paul, as a caregiver, carries around with him that burden. A burden of care for the people that he taught. In particular, in Macedonia, places like Corinth and Thessalonica. So going back to 1 Thessalonians, let me read the rest of that little section. This is the end of verse 3 through verse 5. You yourselves know that we were destined for this. For when we were with you, we kept telling you beforehand that we were to suffer affliction, just as it has come to pass and just as you know. For this reason, when I could bear it no longer, I sent to learn about your faith, for fear that somehow the tempter had tempted you and our labor would be in vain. So how does he talk about his care and his responsibility? On the one hand, again, intellectually, he says, it's not like it's a surprise. Paul, you preached the gospel to the pagan city of Thessalonica. How is that going to go? The same way it went in every other pagan city. Same way it went in most of the Jewish cities. Remember, he's been beat up countless times. This isn't something new that started in Thessalonica. He said, I knew I was going to get beat up. We were destined for this. He knew they were going to get beat up because they were his converts, and that's what was going to happen. There's one thing saying, I'm mentally prepared for this, and another going through it. I'm trying to think of a good comparison. There aren't a lot of good ones. The loss of a loved one who's terminally ill. In your head, you prepare yourself for their passing. And intellectually, you know they're going to die, and you may have even worked out final arrangements, disposition of goods, and healthcare proxy. You've made done all the math and all the homework. Does that mean that you're unmoved when the event happens? No, you're still devastated. Maybe differently than if you weren't prepared, but there's no amount of preparation that makes it enjoyable. Paul knew from the first time he opens his mouth, he's preaching a gospel that's going to get the people he's talking to beat up. It's going to make their life harder to hear what he has to say and believe it. He says, I knew it, and I still know it. Still hurts, doesn't it? And he accepts that. Yeah.
One thing that strikes me is getting back to Timothy. didn't say, why don't you go over to Holinville?
Yeah.
He said, go to Kansas City,
Yeah.
Chicago, because travel would be a huge thing for Timothy to be away from Paul, as well as Paul being by himself. So, for really separation there.
Yeah. Even that. So again, great point. Travel in the ancient world is perilous. That passage we read in 2 Corinthians about in danger of robbers, in danger of rivers, and what are you in danger of rivers for? Like everything you do to travel in the ancient world, liable to get you killed. Cross that river, you might die. Go up and down that river, you might die. Camp on the other side of the river, the robbers might kill you, and you'll die. Right? I mean, there's lots of ways to die, lots of danger, and so he also makes this decision then to send Timothy on a rather dangerous trip, because all trips are dangerous. And who's Timothy? Somebody he considers like a son, whose welfare was entrusted to him by Timothy's mother and grandmother, right? When I was young preacher boy Ben, Dad made this arrangement for me to go work with spend about a month up in Wyoming with a more senior minister that he knew, and wanted me to just follow around a little bit and see what he did and work with him and try to be of some use, but mostly just learn, what ministers do. And so sent me off to Wyoming on this trip, and I was in this other guy's care for about a month. Can you imagine if he calls Dad up and says, Ben was doing such a good job, I sent him over to some other town in some other state to do some work by himself. He'll be fine. Great kid. Right? I mean, that's comparable, not identical, but this was put in his care. Paul feels responsible for Timothy, and so great is his concern for this church in Thessalonica that he's risking someone else he cares about to go check on them and that relationship, while he himself is now left alone in Athens, which hasn't been an especially kind place to him, or Corinth. You see any more emotional language in this section? We got the I could bear it no longer. We mentioned that one already. What else? Fear. Paul, don't you know perfect love casts out fear? Paul, don't you know God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of a sound mind? Well, Paul wrote that last one, so I'm pretty sure he knows it. Doesn't change the fact he was afraid. I mean, he knows, theoretically, God's goodness and grace and mercy is involved in the situation, and it's all in God's hands, and he could preach that sermon. Still, he was personally afflicted by fear, not for himself, but for what was happening to the church he left behind. That's the kind of care he had for them. He sends Timothy's back, and what's Timothy's mission? It's two parts: to establish the young congregation in the face of confusion, to exhort and encourage them, but also to learn about your faith to ease Paul's anxiety over their state. See that again? I sent to learn about your faith for fear. Right? It's not just I sent Timothy because you needed Timothy. He says, I sent Timothy because I couldn't take it anymore. I had to find out how you were doing. I was concerned about you. That's not the way we're used to seeing Paul, emotionally shaken up a little bit. So Paul sent his apprentice minister on a challenging journey, in part because Paul was worried. Okay. Follow-up, before we move back on into 1 Thessalonians, how did this play out? We learned from other epistles how this finally did work out. In 1 Corinthians 16, 5 and 6, Paul says, I will visit you, the Corinthians, after passing through Macedonia, which is Philippi, Thessalonica, for I intend to pass through Macedonia. And perhaps I'll stay with you or even spend the winter so you may help me on my journey wherever I go. Maybe I'll stay with you. I'll get to you, Corinthians, eventually, but I am going, he says it twice, I am going through Macedonia. I'm going to go visit those folks. 2 Corinthians, he mentions that he's already done it. For even when we came into Macedonia, our bodies had no rest. We were afflicted at every turn, fighting without and fear within. Right? He got there, and he was just as bad as he thought, fighting outside, fear inside. But he did get there. He got to those cities, Philippi, Thessalonica, and visited them again. Later in 2 Corinthians, he says, we want you to know, brothers, about the grace of God that's been given among the churches of Macedonia. For in a severe test of affliction, their abundance of joy and their extreme poverty have overflowed in a wealth of generosity on their part. For they gave according to their means, as I can testify, and beyond their means of their own accord, begging us earnestly for the favor of taking part in the relief of the saints. And this not as we expected, but they gave themselves first to the Lord, and then by the will of God to us. What's Paul say to the Corinthians? I got to tell you about these great Christians up in Macedonia. He does it again in chapter 9. Now it is superfluous for me to write to you about the ministry of the saints, for I know your readiness, of which I boast about you to the people of Macedonia, saying that Achaia has been ready since last year, and your zeal was stirred up most of them. But I am sending the brothers so that our boasting about you may not prove empty in this matter, so that you may be ready, as I said you would be ready. Otherwise, if some Macedonians come with me and find that you are not ready, we would be humiliated, to say nothing of you, for being so confident. I thought it was necessary to urge the brothers to go on ahead to you and arrange in advance for the gift, and on and on. Well, it's interesting here. He says, oh, and I'm going to bring some Macedonians with me. So here's the four references. Paul says, I plan to go see them. Paul goes to see them. Paul brags about them to everybody else he saw, and then he plans to drag some of them along with him on future trips to introduce them to other people. Is he a little bit affectionate towards these two churches, Thessalonica and Philippi, and so forth? Yeah.
There's so much of this that resonates with the parent in me.
Right?
You know,
Yeah.
I'm worried about you. I want to make sure you're okay. Are you making good decisions? By the way, don't embarrass me in public. Be ready when we get
Yeah.
there.
Yeah. Lots of strong parent language, which Paul used in the previous chapter. He called himself a mother, called himself a father. That's really how he feels about this. Wanting to kind of show them off when they're doing well. Look, these are my Macedonian children. Look at how they do. They're doing great. You know, he's a doting parent. That's the level of affection he's developed. So what do we learn? This is all point number one. What did we learn about the caregiver? Caring community culture develops when we willingly accept the burden of others as our own. Ben's philosophy of everything is that everything good is in between two extremes, and that's the case here as well. Okay, you could be so detached that you only care about your own problems. Narcissist type behavior. You're completely self-centered. That's no good. Could be such doormat that you take everybody's problems on yourself and are crushed beneath the weight of everybody else's problems because you can't set any healthy boundaries. Also bad. Don't be either. Paul is, responsible for himself. He's doing his work. He's a mature Christian person, but he also has opened himself up to the care of these people personally and not hypothetically. It's not, oh, there are Christians in the world that are suffering. He knows their names. He cares about them. He's making attempts to go see them. Let's think about this from a practical point of view, pragmatic. Of all the things that Paul did in his life, which were going to have the longest impact? The letters that he wrote by himself in a room, or the trip he made to go see some people in some town in Thessalonica? Well, in terms of lasting impact, it's this thing he wrote by himself in a room. Which one was he more excited about? Well, when you read the letter he wrote by himself in the room, all he can talk about is, I'm hoping to come see you guys, right? Those personal relationships actually meant something. And so it's very easy to draw the amount of care you're willing to extend into a pretty small circle around yourself and maybe one or two people that you let in and say, I'll care about them as long as they're not a problem, right? Paul has actually opened himself up to experience the wounds that his brothers and sisters in Christ experienced as if they are his own. That hurts. I'll defer to Jana and other counselors. I'm not entirely sure that's healthy to the degree that Paul does it. Like if I'm Paul's therapist and he says, I feel the pain of every single person I've ever taught the gospel to. I was like, Paul, you need some healthy boundaries, pal. Come on. But I mean, that's the level of care he has. Okay. So you want to have a caring church? It has to start with me and you individually saying, I am open to the concerns of people that are not me. And I'm actually going to be interested in what they're doing. Right? I can't make it happen. You just have to say, okay, I'm going to broaden my circle, maybe a little further than it's healthy. I'm going to care for a few more people than I probably should. And by and large, if you're going to make a mistake that way. I think as humans, our tendency is to shrink the circle and care for as few people, maybe just me, right, as possible. So if you're going to make a mistake caring too much. I think the world would be a better place if we all accidentally cared more than we should. Wouldn't that be rotten of us? No, I think we might be okay. We might be okay. Any thoughts on the caregiver section, on Paul's as a role model of a person extending his concern and empathy and care for other people? True. How does Paul manifest his care? How does he show he cares? Personal contact, and that's both writing them a letter, just in a time when, get me on a hobby horse, in a time when communication was extraordinarily difficult and cumbersome. Paul takes the time to write the Thessalonians not one, but 2 letters in the space of 6 months. You could text like 8,000 people while I'm teaching this class, and I'd never even notice. But Paul sent letters by courier to these people twice in the course of about 6 months. And then visited them as well. Yeah. What are some ways that we show, or we could show, care? That we've expanded our circle of caring a little bit. Some of the same things, right? Send a note, check in on somebody. Prayer, yeah. That one we're going to include in point number 3 especially. But even if they don't know it, the fact that you're taking them before God is one of the things we do in a Christian caregiving community. Absolutely.
Paul wraps a lot of this up in all the one another passages.
Yeah.
Be devoted to one another, honor one another, submit to one another. There's about, 20 of those?
Yeah. Which would mean nothing if Paul hadn't done it. If the people he wrote to, if Paul wrote all these letters saying you need to be more caring, and Paul is this cold, heartless individual who just passed through their lives, those letters mean nothing. But they survive even to today because he wasn't. He was the kind of guy that lived that out. Yeah. Well, before time gets away from me, let me talk about my other 2 observations. The other part is how to receive care. This one's tough, especially in American culture. We're taught to be tough individuals, rugged individuals, take care of ourselves individuals. It's not a bad thing. I like that. It's important to let other people care for you and reciprocate that. So, Bill was mentioning, this sending Timothy back and forth. Imagine the weight involved for Paul and all the things that are working against him here. You got a group of new converts in a city full of idolatry and the work of Satan. Paul twice in the first 3 chapters says Satan was involved. Right? For him, this is not just bad circumstances. This is spiritual, cosmic warfare at work in Thessalonica. And they're separated from Paul, who'd have been their source of teaching. The primary teacher who had changed their lives out of the picture. So now Paul has sent Timothy, and he waits and waits. And again, travels slow, and he waits. He sent Timothy because he couldn't bear it anymore, and then he gets to wait till Timothy makes the long trip down there, spends a little time with them, I don't know, figuring out how things are actually going, trying to do some good, and then makes the long trip back, and he can't like phone call Paul and say, oh, hey, things are going well. Complete radio silence until Timothy walks through the door one day. Are those Christians still faithful? How severe is the persecution? What if they're all dead? Or what if they got beat so much they gave up? Do they resent me for being the preacher that left to go to the next town while they were getting beat up? You think of all the questions that had to be on his mind. Radio silence. No answer until Timothy walks through the door. But now that Timothy has come to us from you and has brought us the good news of your faith and love, and reported that you always remember us kindly and long to see us as we long to see you, for this reason, brothers, in all our distress and affliction, we have been comforted about you through your faith. For now we live, if you are standing fast in the Lord. For what thanksgiving can we return to God for you, for all the joy that we feel for your sake before our God? You hear the emotionally charged language just bubble up. I waited, but then Timothy walked through the door, and guess what he said? He brought us good news. Would you like a little bit of Bible trivia? Okay. What does the word gospel mean? Good news. Yes, it means good news. That's exactly right. It's from the Greek term euangelion, and it's the good news. It's a formal decree of something good that's happened. In the New Testament, the word euangelion, gospel, good news, is always, every single time, used to describe the message of the gospel of Jesus Christ, with one exception. There's only one place in the entire Bible where the good news means anything other than the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ, and it's this verse. Paul says, Timothy brought me the gospel. And what was the gospel? It wasn't Jesus. It was that you're still faithful. He says it was gospel. And it's the same word. Only time anywhere in the New Testament where it means anything other than Jesus. He says, when he came and told me you guys were still faithful, it was like hearing the gospel. It was good news. He told me that you have faith and love. You still like us? Right? I mean, just a simple question. Do they even like me over there anymore? You want to see us again, just like we want to see you, right? Even when I'm in distress and affliction, I'm comforted now. See, the last verse, I had so much fear I couldn't bear it. Now he says, oh, they're still beating me up every day, but I feel good about it because you guys are doing okay. And then this line, for now we live if you're standing fast in the Lord. As long as you're faithful, I'm alive. That's a powerful sentence when you think about it. I've already said that. But this is the only time the term bringing good news is ever applied to anything other than preaching the gospel of Christ in the New Testament. Here it's the gospel of the Thessalonians that Timothy brings back. In all our distress and affliction, we have been comforted about you. For now we live if you are standing fast in the Lord. I only live. I'm trying to think of what's a modern expression that's even like that? You're the reason I get up every morning. I don't know what we even say in English that's that strong. Now I live if you're faithful. Living his best life. It's strong language, right? What does that mean about 5 minutes before Timothy walked in? I was dead inside because I didn't know if you guys were okay. I mean, I was dying here, and now I'm alive. And then in verse 8, going on to the next section, he starts talking about their shared faith that they have. He's prepared to live out the gospel now because he has the good news. And when he talks about his prayers, we're going to get to the prayers in just a second, Paul says, what can I say? Did you catch that? Let me go back. For what thanksgiving can we return to God for you? What can I say? What does it mean when Paul, the guy who had a few words at his disposal, says, I am at a loss, I'm at a lack of words. I don't have words in my prayer to be able to express to God how grateful I am to know you guys are okay. He lacked the words to express his thanks to God. Paul's prayer included a petition to go back and to go work with them again. So here's the point I want to make there. A caring community culture develops when we willingly receive the care given by others and are mutually strengthened. The church at Thessalonica felt the care of Paul. They were moved by it. And then when they send out kind words to Paul, he receives the kindness they extend in the spirit it's given. And it becomes a circle, doesn't it? Thessalonians are encouraged by Paul. Paul is encouraged by the Thessalonians. And it goes round and round and round, right? And that's back to Bill's point about the one another passages, that there's this reciprocating relationship of affection and care. It's never one directional. There's somebody who gives care and there's somebody that gets care. Someone who gives, somebody that gets. It's the cycle of giving and receiving. Some days you are the giver. When Paul was in Thessalonica, he was the giver. He had all the resources. He had the gospel. He had the teaching. He had the miracles. He had the leadership. He had the spiritual gifts. He was the giver. They received. And then he goes down the road, and he is afraid. He is anxious. He is in need of encouragement. And guess who gives it to him? A letter from the Thessalonians. And he receives. Someday you are the giver and some days you receive. And that's good. That doesn't mean you're weak or you failed that day. It means it was your turn. Okay? A lesson I had to repeat quite often. See, I don't talk about myself in lessons like this. I just complain about Celine. Celine, who is certainly far more strong-willed and stubborn than I am, but is a very individualist person, takes care of herself sort of person. She's that kind of gal. So when she had, cancer and all the stuff that went with it, people wanted to come by, and many of you brought her food. You brought me food. I ate it. She couldn't eat. She was vomiting. But I ate lots of the food. People would come by and want to clean up around the house for us, which was great because she said I was doing a terrible job. There was one day I had cleaned and was really worked hard and stuff. And then I left and came back, and Debbie Canfield had come in behind me and apparently correctly cleaned it. And as I was coming back to the house, Celine is gloating about how dirty it had been. I was like, I spent hours on that today. She goes, well, like you do, though. Debbie got it really clean, right? And then, and Celine doesn't want to receive that because she's a strong person. But that was her turn. Tuesday, you want to know where Celine was? The Canfields, Debbie's in the hospital, and they couldn't be at the hospital that day. One of them had to be somewhere, one had to be somewhere else. So Celine was the one who got to sit with Debbie after her procedure this week for several hours. And it was her turn, right? Debbie, who helped us, takes her turn. You'll all get turns. Everybody but me, because I don't need anything. No. Everybody gets turns, right? That's the way it works. And so to be in a caring community, you have to be able to receive, to know you need it, to accept it joyfully, right? To be happy to get it, not resentfully. I can't believe I need that. No, it's great. It's really wonderful. Okay? So those little moments of grace, they mean a lot, and you have to receive them as such. Comments on being better care receivers before I move to the third point. Everyone understands everything perfectly. Good. So finally, what makes this work in a Christian community that is different than just some other kind of group? Any group you could be a part of could conceivably do what I've just said. Right? Anybody could care for each other. Okay. What makes Christian communities different is that we have God in and through and above and under this plan as well. And God is the ultimate participant in the care. And it makes us view it differently. For what thanksgiving can we return to God for you? For all the joy that we feel for your sake before our God, as we pray most earnestly night and day, we may see you face to face and supply what is lacking in your faith. I asked earlier, what's one of the ways we show care? Paul says, I prayed night and day. I prayed and prayed and prayed and prayed and prayed. Okay, and then the next section, he gives you his prayer. Right? This isn't Paul talking about prayer. This is Paul praying. Now may our God and Father himself and our Lord Jesus direct our way to you. And may the Lord make you increase and abound in love for one another and for all, as we do for you, so that he may establish your hearts blameless in holiness before our God and Father at the coming of our Lord Jesus with all his saints. And you just want to say amen at the end, right? It's written as a prayer. May God do this, this, and this for you. It's a blessing. Okay. So Paul knows that this isn't just a relationship between him and these people he cares for back and forth. That would be great. That's a good relationship. Caregiver, care receiver, round and round it goes. Paul believes that God is in the middle of that. Christians view every relationship that way, by the way. This is the same thing you may hear a preacher say at a Christian wedding, right? That any two people can get married. Christians believe there is the husband and the wife, and then there is God abiding in and through it, and that he's partner to that relationship. And it does make a difference to the way you view the marriage. It's also true for Christian relationships. Right? God is in and through that relationship. This seems to be a personal prayer of Paul recorded here in the text. Let's notice real quickly 3 things he asked for, and then I'll comment on each one. He asked the Father and the Son work to guide Paul and his company back to Thessalonica. He prays that they should grow in love, and he prays for God to establish this young congregation so that he's ready for the Lord's coming. All right, so verse 11, Paul asks that the Father and the Son work to guide Paul and his company back to Thessalonica. Paul says, I want to go see you. We read in 1st and 2nd Corinthians, he did go see them. But Paul says, I know that whether or not I get to come see you is actually up to God. The circumstances of my life are not entirely up to me. In chapter 2, he says, I didn't get to come see you because Satan got in the way. So if I'm going to come see you, God's going to have to take me there. So God is responsible for the providential conditions that allow for us to care each other. If you have money in your bank account today sufficient to help somebody who doesn't, God is responsible for that. It's not out of your own merit, your own largesse that you're blessing somebody. God has blessed you, and you are participating in the blessing of God. God has made the conditions possible for the care to take place. Paul prays that Thessalonians should grow in love. God is responsible for the spiritual conditions that allow for us to care for each other. We don't learn how to be selfless by living around other humans. Humans don't teach us to be selfless. Humans teach us to be selfish. Stay tuned for Sunday morning sermon on we're going to do some French philosophy. We're going to do René Girard and mimetic cycles of violence and desire, and then the Sermon on the Mount. But that'll be one slide anyway. But we have these learned traits that we get. We learn selfishness and desire and conflict and rivalry and strife from other people. That's what we get from each other, all the bad stuff. Where do we learn compassion, mercy, grace, tenderness, self-control? Oh, this starts to sound like a list I know. These are the fruit of the Spirit. These are the gifts of God. These are things God has shown us in Christ Jesus. We don't get that from the destructive cycle of people we deal with here. We get that from the infinite grace of God. So if there's going to be any real compassion and affection among us, we're not going to learn it from each other because we haven't got any. We're going to learn it from God, who's going to be our teacher. And then Paul prays for God to establish this young congregation so they would be ready for the Lord's coming. God's responsible for the results of having cared for each other. If we get to the end, and by some consequence, Central Church of Christ becomes the most caring, loving, affectionate church that has ever churched the churchiness of church. Right? I mean, it's just as good as it can possibly get. We wouldn't get there and say, boy, we did a good job. We really cared for each other. What we were supposed to say, if we got there, we would know. We would say, wow, look at what God has done. God made some caring people care for each other. He gave them the conditions. He He gave them the spiritual qualities necessary to care for each other. He gets credit for all the results. He did the work. Which, you might have noticed, I skipped over a phrase early in the chapter. Almost done, I promise. Back in verse 2, when Paul was describing Timothy, he called Timothy God's co-worker in the gospel of Christ. What a statement. He is God's colleague, God's co-worker. He can't even brag on Timothy without acknowledging that whatever great thing Timothy does, he does it in cooperation with God. I mean, this is actually a compliment, but it's a compliment that recognizes God is doing the work, and this great thing that Timothy does, Timothy's doing it with God. So a caring community culture develops when we recognize that we are merely participants in God's overwhelming care for all people. We're participants in the love of God. We're not great humanitarians. We're not philanthropists. We're not trying to accumulate enough merit through enough good deeds. God has shown us grace, and we're just trying to live on that. And that makes all the difference. So, summary, and then it's time for you to discuss. You get 5 or 10 minutes before the kids storm the gates. A caring community culture develops when we willingly, another typo, accept the burdens of others as our own. A caring community culture develops when we willingly receive the care given by others and are mutually strengthened. A caring community culture develops when we recognize that we are merely participants in God's overwhelming care for all people. Thoughts and comments on that kind of, that's a church I'd like to go to, right? That's all right. That's what you're looking for. I said I was going to pick on Jana, and so now I will. See? Mostly because it keeps Colin from talking if I ask you a question. So how do you know, I want to talk about number 1, accepting the burdens of others. When do you know when you've opened yourself up to the right amount of care for other people as opposed to getting walked all over and trampled on, and those two extremes of completely isolated and self-centered and I'm so overwhelmed by other people's problems that I'm drowning here.
Part of it is when you lose who you are. And you're forming yourself to what you think others need to be.
Yeah, I think Paul, I've never doubted that Paul had a pretty strong sense of his own identity. Like, he knew what he was doing, he knew what he was about, and because he knew what he was about, he could then accept the burdens of other people. I'm not a very good swimmer, but I tell this story quite often. In early years, my parents they took me down to Seminole State College to take, a swimming class to learn how to swim. It's one of many classes I did poorly in life. And at one point, the swimming instructor looks at me and says, "If someone is drowning, you should not help them, because then there will be 2 people drowning." Okay? And I've used that as an example a lot in pastoral counseling. Like, if you haven't got enough of your act together to tread water, you can't help anybody else. And it's not because you're not loving enough or whatever. You do have to kind of have your feet under you a little bit to offer help. Otherwise, both of you fall down. John Netherton, down the hall, went to Polo's the other day for lunch, and it's like the shady part of the street, so that sidewalk is still a sheet of ice, and John began to slip, and I did not offer to catch him, because then there would be 2 of us on the ground. I just felt like I was being considerate, and I let him. You would have done the same thing, I know, yeah. But there is a delicate balance of, you do need to be self-sacrificing. Jesus teaches us that. But Jesus is big enough to be self-sacrificing. You got to kind of have your feet under you a little bit to do that. And that's.
In my office, I use the analogy, and what you said made me think of this, is, when you're on an airplane with a small child or with somebody who is infirm with something,
Oh, yeah.
and the flight attendant
'Cause then we just have two people passed out, right? Yeah, yeah. That's a good metaphor. Not as good as the swimming one, but it's pretty good. Yeah, yeah. It's good. What else do we think about any of these three that catch your attention? Yeah, yeah. Just letting someone help you, it's important. And thank you is a perfectly good answer, even to imperfect help. Like, all right, just me and you and all the people online, but I'll tell you this with candor, okay, because I love you, without naming names. Not every meal I've been brought as a preacher was as good as every other meal. Some of them were fantastic, some of them were passable. Do you think I said, well, you shouldn't be the one to bring me food next time? No, I said thank you. And I meant it, every word of it, and ate every bite of it. Because it's important for them and it's important for me to be part of that cycle. And whacked my kids in the back of the head if they said otherwise, right? Because that gratefulness is part of that process. You learn it. You got to have it. It's good. Other thoughts or comments? Colin, I cut you off earlier in favor of your wife, but if you want to comment now, you're unmuzzled. Okay. Any others? Yes. Yeah, Lewis was real big on, if you just act like you love people, you might accidentally start loving them. But I can promise you, if you act like you hate people, you'll never start loving them. So if you're not sure, fake it. Just pretend to love people for a little while. And in American thought and philosophy, you think about it first and then you do it. And we're actually backwards from everybody else in the world. Most people, you do it and then you understand it. A lot of Christian life, you do it first and then you understand it. I was baptized many years ago, and still today I have insights of like, oh, you know what else baptism means? It's like you're still, like the rest of your life, working out the meaning of this decision you made. You say, I do, and you get married, and you got it all figured out, right? No, you spend the rest of your life figuring out that decision you just made. And sometimes you fake it, and you say, I'm going to love this person because it's cheaper than the alternatives, right? And you fake it, and then you figure out, I actually do love this person. Turns out care works that way in church as well. If you see somebody you don't like and try to go like them and pretend you like them, lo and behold, you kind of end up liking people. It's terrible. I was talking to a college missions guy several years ago in Baptist churches, actually. He was working with Southern Baptist College missions plant somewhere in Colorado. And he was describing to me kind of the struggle of, there's no churches in his area, Southern Baptist or otherwise. They would just, he was trying to plant something over in this part of Colorado that was kind of very secular minded. And he was trying new things, right, to spread the gospel. And some of them worked, some of them didn't. Not all of them went over well with some of his Southern Baptist sponsors. It's like, that's not how we do things. And his response to them that I will never forget was, I like my way of doing it badly better than your way of not doing it. And I think that probably applies to a lot of Christian things. Like, yeah, we should all try to do it the best possible way. Absolutely. Strive for excellence in everything you do. But doing it badly is probably better than not doing it. And that's true with sharing the gospel, caring for other people, worshiping God. Doing it badly is probably better than not attempting it. So get out of your head a little bit and go do a thing. Yeah. Okay, I'm done. Thanks for your comments. We'll pick up. He's going to change tune a little bit and change subject just a little bit in chapter 4. Chapter 4 starts out with the word finally, and there's 2 more chapters to go. So like a typical preacher, the word finally and in conclusion means nothing.